Every so often, a single frame from an old movie makes people stop scrolling. Someone shares a still from The Sound of Music, and in the comments someone else insists it must be photoshopped because what's happening in the background just doesn't look real. It isn't edited. It's exactly what the camera caught in 1964, and once you know the story behind it, you can't unsee it. This is a tour through the frames, the props, and the moments that look staged but weren't, hiding in plain sight in one of the most beloved musicals ever made. Let's start with the guitar Maria carries into the Von Trapp house. Look closely at Julie Andrews' hands in the early strumming scenes, and you'll notice they're stiff, almost mechanical, nothing like the loose, practiced fingers of someone who grew up playing. That's because she hadn't. Andrews had never touched a guitar before signing on for the role, and the production brought in a coach to teach her just enough to look convincing on camera. She struggled to sing and strum at the same time, a skill that takes most musicians years to make look effortless. To calm her nerves before those takes, she would occasionally have a small glass of Austrian schnapps, the local spirit, just enough to loosen up before the cameras rolled. Christopher Plummer went through similar guitar and vocal coaching to prepare for his role as the captain, but if you compare his on-screen playing to the actual audio, they don't match. His singing and guitar work in the final cut were dubbed by a professional musician brought in specifically for that purpose, so the voice you hear is not his at all. Now freeze the frame during the rowboat scene, right as the boat capsizes and the children tumble into the lake. It looks chaotic in a fun, choreographed way, but there's a real accident buried in that shot. Kim Carruth, who played the youngest daughter Gretel, could not swim. The plan was for Julie Andrews to grab her the instant the boat flipped, but Andrews lost her footing and went under herself, unable to reach the child in time. Carruth swallowed a significant amount of lake water and became so sick from it that she vomited immediately afterward, right onto Heather Menzies, the actress playing one of the older daughters. It's a moment played for laughs in the final film, but behind the scenes, it was a genuine scare for everyone on set. Here's a photo that looks almost too dramatic to be candid. A production still of Christopher Plummer looking visibly tired and heavier than in earlier promotional shots. That weight change wasn't makeup or camera angles. Plummer was famously unhappy making this film. He thought the material leaned too far in a sentimentality for his taste, and he mocked it privately with nicknames that played on the title in unflattering ways. To cope with his frustration during the long shoot, he ate and drank more than usual, enough that the wardrobe department had to alter his costumes partway through filming to accommodate his changing frame. It's a strange footnote to a movie now remembered so fondly, but Plummer eventually admitted, years later, that he understood why audiences loved it so much, even if he never fully warmed to it himself. If you've ever seen a tourist photo from Salzburg claiming to show the real Von Trapp house, take a second look because it's misleading. The mansion on screen doesn't exist as a single building. Filmmakers combined the exteriors of two separate properties, one for the front of the house and a different one for the back, while every interior room was built as a set on a studio lot far from Austria. The gazebo, where 16 going on 17 was filmed, wasn't part of any historic estate either. It was constructed purely for the production and has since been moved twice, now sitting at Hellbrunn Palace in Salzburg, where visitors can see it firsthand. Even the Abbey courtyard where Maria lived as a novice was a set piece, an incredibly detailed replica built by a production designer who matched the stonework and window details so precisely that many visitors to Salzburg still believe those scenes were filmed at the genuine abbey. And that eerie graveyard scene, where the family hides from Nazi search parties among the headstones, was shot entirely on a studio backlit in Hollywood, despite decades of tour guides in Austria insisting otherwise. Take a photo of the sheet music for Edelweiss and show it to someone who grew up in Austria, and there's a good chance they won't recognize it as anything traditional because it isn't. Despite feeling like a centuries-old folk song, Edelweiss was written specifically for the Broadway version of this story by the American songwriting team behind nearly every song in the show. It turned out to be the final piece that duo ever wrote together, since one of the two songwriters passed away less than a year after the stage musical debuted. Despite its American origins, the song has been mistaken for genuine Austrian heritage by audiences around the world ever since. Here's an image worth studying. An old contract page from the mid-1950s, the kind you'd assume was completely unremarkable. This particular one changed the financial future of an entire family. A German producer approached the real Maria von Trapp about adapting her memoir for film and offered her a flat payment for the rights. When she asked about receiving a share of any future profits, she was told that German law prevented royalty payments to non-citizens, and since she'd become an American citizen by then, she wasn't eligible. She believed him and signed away all rights to her own story. Weeks later, the same producer returned with a smaller cash offer if she'd agreed to settle immediately, and given how little the family had earned from performing up to that point, she accepted. She later learned there had never been any such law. It was a fabrication used to secure her story cheaply. The composing team behind the eventual stage musical chose to give the Von Trapps a portion of the earnings anyway, even though nothing obligated them to, though it amounted to only a fraction of what the family might have earned had they kept their rights from start. Picture a school attendance record from a small Austrian town in the 1920s, and you'll find something the movie never mentions. Maria wasn't hired to look after 7 children at once. She was brought in to tutor a single child, a daughter who also happened to be named Maria, after the girl contracted scarlet fever, the same illness that had taken her mother's life years earlier. The illness left her unable to make the long walk to school, so the family reached out to the nearby abbey for help, and a 21-year-old trainee nun was sent to fill in as a home tutor, expected to stay only about 10 months before returning to her religious training full-time. Life had other plans. Now, consider a casting memo, the kind of internal studio document nobody ever expects the public to see. The screenwriter working on the adaptation had exactly one actress in mind for the lead from the start. The director, on the other hand, initially favored a retired actress turned European royal and a well-known musical star instead. Everything changed when he watched unreleased test footage of the actress originally suggested, footage from a different film she'd shot, but that hadn't come out yet, and he was won over instantly. Even then, she hesitated before accepting, worried the story might come across as overly sweet, a concern the director and screenwriter shared, which reassured her enough to sign on for a substantial salary by the standards of the time. Look at any home photo of the real Von Trapp family, and you'll notice something the movie completely reverses. The father is remembered by his surviving children as warm, playful, and generous, not the rigid disciplinarian shown barking orders through a whistle in the film. Yes, he really did use a whistle with distinct signals for each child. And yes, matching sailor outfits were a real thing in their household, but marching in formation and cold detachment were dramatic inventions. According to people who studied the family closely, it was actually the woman who became their stepmother who had to learn how to express affection, having been raised in a much harsher environment herself. The youngest of the real children later described his father in interviews as charming and open, adding that his mother tried unsuccessfully to convince the filmmakers to portray his father more accurately. Here's a detail that never made it into a single frame of the finished film: a Catholic priest who became the family's actual musical mentor. During the financial collapse of the 1930s, the family lost much of their fortune and began renting rooms in their home to make ends meet. One tenant happened to be a priest with serious musical training, and after hearing the family sing together, he recognized real potential and became their vocal coach, shaping them into a genuinely skilled performing group. He later fled Austria alongside them and toured with the family for years afterward. The filmmakers decided a real clergyman guiding their music would distract from the story they wanted to tell, so they invented a secular character to fill that role instead, erasing his contribution from the historical record as far as most audiences know. If you ever see a photo captioned, "The Real Maria, Quiet and Reserved," treat it with suspicion because it contradicts everything she said about herself. Orphaned young and raised by an uncle she described as harsh, she eventually trained as a teacher before deepening her religious faith and entering the abbey. Far from the calm, gentle character on screen, she openly admitted to being disruptive as a young novice, breaking dishes, talking during periods meant for silence, sprinting through courtyards, whistling sacred chants in ways considered inappropriate, and even climbing onto the convent roof. She once described her younger self in blunt terms as the worst example imaginable of what a proper novice should be. Consider a marriage certificate dated years before the family's dramatic escape from Austria, and the movie's timeline falls apart entirely. Children's names in the film matched the real family at all. The actual children, from oldest to youngest, carried entirely different names, and the oldest was in fact a grown man working as a doctor by the time the family fled, not a teenage girl. 3 additional children born after the second marriage don't appear in the story at all, since including them would hear something worth noticing on any cast list from the production. None of them have complicated an already dense narrative. One more photograph deserves a closer look, a production budget ledger from the studio that made this film. Before this movie existed, the studio behind it had poured a staggering amount of money into a separate historical epic that went wildly over budget and nearly bankrupted the company. When this smaller, less certain musical arrived on the release schedule, executives worried movies about singing families had already fallen out of fashion. Instead, it became the highest-grossing film of its year, and within roughly a year and a half, it had overtaken a decades-old Civil War epic as the highest-grossing film of all time. The profits didn't just make the movie a classic. They rescued the entire studio from financial collapse. So next time somebody insists a photo from this film looks too strange, too coincidental, or too dramatic to be real, remember that the true story behind the camera was often stranger than what ended up on screen. Nothing here was edited. It just took a closer look to see it.